All right. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Walisha Wilson-Menefee, and I'm excited to welcome you all. Thank you all, first of all, for joining us for our very first event of Reentry Awareness Month. And if you're in Georgia, Reentry Awareness Month is something really big, and hopefully you've heard of it. You should, because for the last 10 years, we have been requesting from the Georgia governor to request to receive a proclamation to honor July as Reentry Awareness Month throughout the state. And we ask supporters and other advocates throughout the communities to do things throughout the state to honor the event. But this is something that is very near and dear to us, and this is our busiest month. That's why we have so many events that are done during this time. So we want to thank you all for joining us. This event is something that's actually very near and dear as well. As a formerly incarcerated woman, um, and who was in the news and also see it daily as people are in the news. It is a conversation that should be had because I've seen a lot of things happen based off what people have read or seen in the news. And so I wanted to first start off by saying that journalists and news stations have failed the most basic responsibility of journalism, which is to me to report the news accurately and without bias. In newspaper reports, whether for the same crime or lesser offenses, white people are often depicted in a more positive light than Black people through the use of terms that they are referred to, such as team versus suspect, the placing of the story, the size of the headline, and the photos that they use. Of course, we've all seen where they use yearbook photos for white kids and they use mugshots for Black folks. This phenomenon is often cited as a form of racial media bias that can influence public perceptions of a person's level of dangerousness and guilt. This is especially harmful as public perception does indeed reach and creep into the courtroom. How many times have we read stories where prosecutors have eliminated Black jurors, have refused to listen to facts based on the race of the person who's being convicted, or where race or sentences are actually longer for Black folks than white people with the same charges? There have been many reports where there have been key findings from those reports that shows that mugshots are actually used in 45% of news cases that involve Black folks compared to only 8% of white suspects. White victims were nearly 4 times more likely to be presented in photos and with their families and friends than Black people, who are often the victims. So often when white folks are victims, they show pictures of them being with their family and their friends. But some reason, somehow, even when Black people are victims, there's a reason to find out what may have happened to them that may have caused their demise. We saw that with Trayvon Martin, which really ticked me off because even though him being a victim of walking through a neighborhood, it somehow needed to come out that he had marijuana in his system, which sort of excuses George Zimmerman's behavior. Also, media coverage is 50% more likely to refer to white defendants by their name as opposed to Black defendants. So there's this thing about humanization versus criminalization, whether a person is victim or who has caused the harm when school photos with friends. In contrast, using mugshots for Black people strips away individuals' personal life context, meaning that they're not human at all. They just focus on the criminal. And I'm going to go through a brief presentation with you all, but just in your mind as we go through this, I want you to think of some notable cases, particularly Brock Turner, the Stanford sexual assault case in which the media widely used his swimming photo rather than his mugshot, which was not even released until 16 months after his arrest. But again, with Black folks, they'll throw mugshots up before we've even been convicted. And just the psychological and social impact of doing this, whether it's prejudice through disproportionate exposure to mugshots, given this stereotype of Black criminality, and the sentencing policies, which we already know that there's a negative disproportionate about this. Just the negative images in the media affect how Black people are treated in real life. The criminalization of Black teens. Studies have shown that dominant stereotype of constantly showing Black males in the media when it comes to anything that's violent does have an effect on young Black children. Even with 19-year-old murder of the murder victim, Renisha McBride, she was known as a drunk woman. And that was reported by NBC News. Not that she was a victim. They didn't show her family photos. They made it somehow an issue that she was a drunk woman. So we're going to go through this slide. I'm going to do it really, really fast because I got about 7 minutes to get this done. And then from this, I'm going to introduce you to our journalists, our guest speakers, and then they're going to have a discussion of why they're doing this great work, why they have decided to not be like the rest of the folk who are doing this awful, whether it's the pictures and using the dehumanizing language. And I think you're going to find the conversation very beneficial and you're going to enjoy it. So if you can actually see the screen, somebody just shout out that you're able to see the screen. And can you see the screen?
We can see it.
Okay. I'm going to hide this little floating thingy. Okay. So again, this is Beyond Felon and Inmate, a call for media to transform crime reporting through humanizing language and without bias. And we are doing this in partnership with Courier, Georgia, and Prism, as well as our latest guest, Mr. Derek Trumbo. So we really appreciate you all joining us today. How do you do this thing? There we go. When it comes to race and crime, media bias is a huge problem and it needs to stop. So this basically stems from implicit bias, which refers to the unconscious attitudes, stereotypes, prejudices, and automatic associations that people hold towards certain groups of people without their conscious awareness or the deliberate intent. And in all honesty, I think a lot of us have implicit bias. I mean, sometimes myself, if I'm going to a neighborhood that doesn't look too right, I'm gonna lock my door. So I think we have these implicit bias, but I think that a line is crossed when you allow your implicit bias to impact the work that you're doing. Same thing with doctors or teachers. I think it's that same thing when we're dealing with people in the media. And these hidden cognitive biases directly warp how journalists, editors, and media outlets frame news stories, select sources, and report on public events. In media coverage and crime reporting, these biases heavily influence how journalists select their stories, frame the narratives, and choose the language that they're going to use. So, when reporting on vulnerable populations such as racial minorities or unhoused individuals or people with a criminal history, implicit bias significantly shapes public perception, reinforces harmful systemic stereotypes, shifts public empathy, and distorts the presumption of innocence by compromising systemic fairness. And then this just goes in just a little bit more about the impact of that implicit biasness, how vulnerable populations and ideal victims. Media coverage often skews toward the concept of the ideal victim. These are individuals who are perceived as innocent, vulnerable, and more worthy of sympathy, such as white women or young children, and dismisses the victimization of others. And therefore, there's this empathy gap that certain people are receive less empathy and more folks. Then there's the issue of framing the disparities. Studies show that when white individuals are victimized, outlets are significantly more likely to feature them in sympathetic photographs with their family and friends compared to victims from minority backgrounds. And of course, we don't like to use words like suspects, and I apologize if we see it going through that. I try my best to cross it out because we do believe in using humanizing language. But people of interest is what you should be called, and those with a criminal history. So when you're reporting on people of interest who are suspected of or who have committed a crime, implicit bias dictates how that story is framed and who is deemed a threat. So we talk about this with mugshot bias. Certain people will use yearbook and photos and graduation for white suspects, but they use mugshots for people of color. When you're doing criminal history labeling and you're talking about a person's past criminal record, rather than using person first language, they rely on terms that strip an individual of humanity, such as I can remember about 6 or 7 years ago, I read an article of a man in Florida who jumped out of his car because there was a 2-year-old child that was walking around in the highway and could have gotten killed. He dodged through traffic, risking his own life to save a white child who could have been killed. But instead of the headline saying something about hero saves, stranded toddler on highway, it says felon saves child on highway. And I didn't understand what was the purpose and the need to note the fact that he had been to prison. That doesn't take away from the fact that he still was a hero. Also, well documented Black crime implicit bias happens in newsrooms where crimes committed by people is often Black people is often overrepresented compared to the actual arrest rates. We all know that the crime that has the most, over 70% of most crimes are property crimes. But we hardly ever hear about that. We hear about the most violent crimes, and then we do hear about um, crimes that have happened by Black people. You tend to show them a lot. You tend to show them at the peak of the hours where people get them, and you're not talking about the ones that really do matter. And then there's also understanding the mechanics of this implicit biases as how their automatic association. The brain uses quick mental shortcuts to process complex information rapidly. So they go to what they seem, and basically what I feel is intentional by the media outlets is to make sure that your eyes are drawn to that. It is cultural conditioning, meaning the media consumption, social circles, and structural racism fuel these hidden biases. And then there's this unconscious behavior that they may have had well intentions by doing it, but they unknowingly choose words and angles that reinforce harmful cultural stereotypes. So we're going to talk real briefly about dehumanizing language, asymmetric backgrounding, which is what we talked about, talking about what happened. People say, well, we didn't see the whole story. We need to see the whole video clip. You're not focusing on the police officer choking out a man who can't breathe. You're so interested about you need to see the first 15 minutes of what happened to cause a police officer to choke out somebody who could not breathe for stealing a loaf of bread. And also visual bias, which we've already talked about, the mugshots. So when we talk about dehumanizing language, these are words that the media uses to incite fear. Felon and ex-felon, convict, ex-con, offender, and this is including using the term sex offender. And just a little note that everybody who's on the sex offender registry has not actually sexually offended anybody. People are on the sex offender registry for peeing in the wrong place. The youngest child on the Georgia sex offender registry is an 8-year-old autistic child for peeping under a little girl's bathroom stall. So it's these kind of terms that incite fear people. Inmate and prisoner, criminal, addict, and homeless, aggressive, juvenile or delinquent, unsupervised. And so we want you to use going forward in your own language some terms to avoid this. Anybody can do them, but we particularly would like journalists to use these words. Instead of using an inmate or a prisoner, a convict or felon, you say a person who is incarcerated or an incarcerated person or a person with a felony. When you're talking about someone with sex offense, you say a person with a sex offense. Instead of using the mentally ill or crazy or the R word, you would say a person with mental illness or a person with developmental intellectual disability, a person who is unsheltered or a person with a substance use dependency, a person with diabetes or a person with HIV or living with HIV and AIDS. That humanizes that you're talking about a person first and not whatever affliction or whatever life circumstances they've dealt with. So when we talk about asymmetric background, this is where you're using mugshots versus family photos. You have it where you talk about the socioeconomic issues, using terms like trouble teen. When you're dealing with white suspects and something happened, you say it was because he's a troubled teen or he somehow lost his way. But when Black teens or Black folks are used, it's talking about he was very aggressive, or he was a super predator, or he was a thug, even though they're the same age. It's those kind of things that do it, or when it excuses vigilantism. High profile cases of white vigilantes have often featured extensive media dives into their hobbies and patriotism to explain their actions. But when Black victims of violence are scrutinized for minor infractions to justify their treatment, and then when Black folks are, even when they're criminal, I mean, even when we're victimized, research shows that when you're covering Black suspects, the media heavily emphasizes their criminality without exploring their community or their family support systems. But when white individuals are arrested, they're frequently framed within the context of coming from caring and grieving and supporting families. And I've also seen that come from when something happens with white people, they always get quotes from the families. But when something happened with Black folks, a lot of time those quotes come from their lawyers or judge. They don't go and get quotes from that. And when we talked about this, we talked about Trayvon Martin already, but with Ahmaud Arbery, instead of seeing him as a victim, you want to mention the fact that he had mental illness. You want to talk about prior conviction, and that was the focal point of what was going on. And so I'm not going to go through all this, and you will receive the slides, but just some side-by-side comparisons. Tamir Rice versus Dylan Roof. Tamir Rice was a 12-year-old black child holding a toy gun. Dylan Roof was a 21-year-old white man who killed 9 black folks in a church. But the media published a headline noting that Rice's maternal grandfather had a history of domestic violence. Ain't got nothing with anything, do with anything. As opposed with Roof, it was heavily emphasized how quiet he was and how he relied on anxiety medication and how his family was devastated. But no mention about how Tamir Rice's family was devastated. Michael Vaughn was an unarmed 18-year-old shot by police in Ferguson. James Home was a 24-year-old white man who fired inside a Colorado movie theater, killing 12 people. But he was framed as being highly intelligent, brilliant, former neuroscience student who was deeply into his academic pressures caused his psychological break. But Brown was mentioned as he was no angel. Same thing with Stephon Clark, who was shot by police in his grandmother's backyard, as well as Stephen Paddock, who was a 64-year-old white man who committed the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history in Las Vegas. But he was just a wealthy retired accountant who loved high stakes and gambling. So it's this kind of thing. And again, we talked about the visual biases of using mugshots. So I want to go through this before we end, before I turn it over. When you look at this, just think about what you see when you see this. This was an article that was in a Mississippi newspaper. So just looking at it, the first thing you see, the first focal point is a black man who is a burglary, suspected of burglary. But over here in the corner on the left side, for a crime that is way worse than burglary, is a white man who killed somebody. But his is on the left-hand side, out of the way, very small. Doesn't look like they used a mugshot picture for him. And so as you can see, what I'm talking about is your eyes immediately go to whatever's larger and bigger, making it seem like, oh my God, black folks are just awful. They're just breaking in folks' stuff. And you completely forgot about the 19-year-old over here in the corner who then took somebody's life. These are, and they could have intentionally, they didn't have to intentionally do that, but they intentionally did that. And so this just was telling you about some of the information that did. And in contrast, it does the same things when you're talking about humanizing folks. And this was larger centered photos of mugshot as opposed to the other one. And that's always our focal point to go into the beginning. This was the Iowa. Same newspaper covered the same article, same sister stations. These guys on the left, the white boys, committed a crime, same crime, but they showed the white boys in suits. And they showed the black men in mugshots. The two organizations claimed it's because the mugshots for the white boys were not readily available when the news article came out. And so the only pictures they had to go on were their actual school photos. Well, I'm sure with just a little extra digging, you probably could have went and dug out some high school photos. Or furthermore, if you couldn't find equitable photos for the black men, you should have just not used photos at all. Same thing. So before you even say maybe the black men didn't have yearbook photos, ask yourself first if you really believe that and if the report really wanted to find good humanizing photos. Same thing with here. When we see folks that's going through court, you always see the white folks that's able to have on a suit and come and be around in court, but they always show the ones of us handcuffed in our jumpsuit. And when we're using terms and labels, usually when you hear labels with white folks as opposed to black folks, you hear father, son, man. But then with other black defendants, you hear accused, murdered, juvenile, those kind of things. And the same thing they did with Ahmaud Arbery. That term again, he was acting aggressively. Those are terms that people use to do that. So this has a lot of psychological impacts. It has a lot of sociological impacts to try to justify state-sanctioned violence, institutionalize dehumanization, policy and legal disparities. The psychological impacts mean it diminished in-group empathy. meaning there's certain people who are worthy of empathy and those who aren't, internalized stigma and stress, and implicit bias reinforcements, stripping police of narrative monopoly. And so just a few other things that we'll make sure that I'll make sure I send this to you. But this is how alternative and independent media are changing crime reporting. They're framing violence as a public health crisis. They're rejecting dehumanizing formats and coded language. They're giving journalistic power to impact the communities. And they're actually doing the great, great stuff. So hopefully when everybody leaves here, and our call is to media, is for them to forego images that drive perceptions of guilt, that they avoid labels that carry negative connotation and use more neutral language, and that they ensure parity in how white and black victims are covered. So I'll make sure I send you all of these things once I go back and tweak it and everything is together. So I went over about 5 minutes and I do apologize, but I want to make sure we got some of this through so folks can understand what we're talking about when you're looking at the news. Because the media, you thought TikTok has a lot of influence and Facebook has a lot of influence, but the media has a lot of influence. Um, Especially when you're talking about people who have to go to court. And then they say, oh, if you're going to be on a jury, you can't be read about this story anywhere. How is that possible when people are watching the news? So I'm going to turn it over. And I would like for Colleen, as of Courier, Georgia, Tina Perez of Prism, and then we have journalist Derek Trumbo to introduce themselves. And once they introduce themselves, I have a question for them. And then they're going to go ahead and talk amongst themselves as journalists.
Okay, I'll go first, and then Derek, you want to go, and then Tina? Okay, perfect. First of all, Walisha, thank you so much for having us. And you went 7 minutes over, but I kind of wish that you had gone an hour over because I could have just sat there listening to that entire presentation. And like Tina said in the chat, it's such important context, and it's going to frame the entire conversation. I'm going to send that slideshow to everyone. I'm putting it in my journalist newsletters. So my name is Colleen Hamilton. I am the political correspondent at Courier, Georgia. And my role breaks down into two parts. So first, I cover all of our elections here in Georgia. And second, I do investigative reporting into all forms of injustice in our state. And that has meant looking very closely at corruption and violence within the Georgia Department of Corrections. I became passionate about this work because I volunteered inside for many years, and I saw exactly like Walisha was saying that journalists have failed incarcerated people by relying on state-sanctioned narratives by the government, by the Georgia Department of Corrections, for example, rather than the lived experiences and stories of people who have first-person experience. And if you're in journalism school, you always hear who's the person that you want to find, right? It's the person who witnessed the event. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today, to talk about how we can make both more humanized and fact-based reporting because those two things, in my opinion, go hand in hand. Um, Derek, how are you?
Hello, everyone. I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I was incarcerated for 20 years. I saw a lot of very bad things, but I also saw a lot of really good things come about because of my incarceration. Um, I'm here today because my wonderful editor, Tina Vasquez, was kind enough to take a chance on me when I had so many doors shut on me because of the fact that I was an incarceration impacted writer. So I'm very happy to be a part of this today. I look forward to answering any questions and hope to share more of my work with you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tina Vasquez. I am the features editor at a small nonprofit newsroom called Prism. I work with Derek. I love working with Derek. I'm his editor. He has a column at Prism that he writes monthly now. Previously, it was bi-weekly. And I also oversee a fellowship program for what we call movement journalists, or journalists who see journalism as a tool for liberation. And many of them are also covering the criminal legal system, where they're grappling with a lot of these language issues in newsrooms as freelancers, where they have less power to sort of change the conditions of a newsroom. So this is something that we talk about a lot with our fellows at Press On. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And I know Colleen connected us with Derek at the last minute. But Derek, I did not know you were formerly incarcerated, and we don't believe in slavery around here. So when you get done, you send us your Cash App, and we're gonna send you $150 for appearing on this website tonight, because we don't believe in folks sharing their experiences and their talents and their contributions for free. Now, Colleen, we know y'all got jobs, and we are a
I'm paying
volunteer
him. I'm paying him.
organization.
Don't worry. I already got it covered. I got it covered.
So, but we're gonna send him something too, because it is awesome when you have a lot of folks who want you to be reporters. They want you to sit on panels. They want you to do this. They want you to tell your story. They want you to do this, and they don't offer you a bologna sandwich or nothing. So we want to make sure that I didn't acknowledge that, and I like you a lot better now. So thank you. So thank you all so much for joining us. And I have one question for you all before the end, just in case you didn't see, since Colleen was talking. We're actually going to be partnering again this Saturday. If you are a formerly incarcerated woman who would like to interview with Colleen about your experience of slavery. As you know, we're working at New Life Second Chance to end Georgia's legal law that legalizes slavery for people who are convicted of a crime. And Colleen's doing an article on it. So if you have experienced that, either by having to work for free as a term of your condition of probation, or for while you're in jail or prison, or through work release while in a Georgia Transitional Center, please, and you're in Atlanta, please join us in person. I'll drop the registration link if you're able to come. Lunch is free. It is an unpaid focus group, but it is a paid hot lunch. You'll get to be able to have your story told of your experiences. And don't worry if for some reason you're not in Atlanta and can't come to Atlanta, but you're outside of Atlanta, or you're outside, or you're a man and you want to be able to get your experience as well. We dropped Colleen's information. And so that way you can connect with her and you can get an interview done by phone or video. And so right now, the question I would like to ask, and we'll start with backwards and let Derek answer first, and then we'll do Tina, and then we'll do Colleen. So my question is, which I didn't even know this with Derek, so this is a no given. I might not even need Derek to ask the question now. What was the pivotal point, or maybe a news story that you saw that made you decide to, or reevaluate the way you reported stories so that they centered humanity, dignity, equity, and justice? So Derek, you ain't really got to answer, because we already know why you talk like that. But if you would like to answer, please do. Why didn't you
Okay.
choose to do it like other people, just to grab headlines? Maybe that's a better question for you.
Okay. So, like in Georgia and other places, Kentucky has a rule on the law books that says slavery is illegal unless you are an inmate or prisoner. And I spent many years working 8 to 12 hours a day for 80 cents a day. That's $16 a month. And I reached out to Tina, and I was already writing my stories, but I wanted to do some journalism about the wages and the slave wages in prison. Not just about from a standpoint of an inmate or prisoner or incarceration impacted person having to do this work, but also why the system was set in place. So me and Tina co-wrote this piece, which won us a Stillwater Award, but I wanted to lay everything out about what was happening, why it was happening, and I was able to interview many people that I was incarcerated with who had their own stories to tell, because I didn't want it to be just one perspective. I wanted it to come from many different perspectives, their life and social situations, as well as how that meager amount of money they received impacted their life decisions and choices. That's available on Prism. Anybody can go read it, and I recommend it highly. That's why I decided to speak up.
Thank you
I'm
so much.
sorry.
And if you have the link to that, Derek, drop it.
Yeah,
If
that's
you
what I
can
was going to
find the
ask
link
for a
to it.
link. If you got a link.
Okay. What about you, Tina? What was your why?
Yeah. I came into reporting about the criminal legal system from immigration. So, kind of reporting on that intersection of the criminalization of immigrants and then mass incarceration. I grew up, my dad's a Mexican immigrant who came to the US as an undocumented immigrant. I come from a mixed status family. So, for me, it was really kind of seeing the coverage of immigrants and how the media reported on, who was deserving of this really empathetic profile and who was deserving of detention and deportation and family separation. And just kind of, it was in the waters that I swam in as a young person who was interested in journalism, who read newspapers, who saw the coverage of immigrant communities. And so it really started there for me in thinking very thoughtfully about immigration coverage, which then expanded to reporting on the criminal legal system and working with Derek. And Derek truly changed how I thought about journalism in terms of the ways that we should collaborate with people inside, or the ways that we can collaborate with incarcerated people. If you're willing to, if you have a newsroom that's willing to do that. But yeah, my entry point really came from my family.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah, I think
Colleen.
my entry point came when I was volunteering inside. The place that I was working at was, unfortunately, everyone called it the compound. And it was where young men, some as young as 14 years old, were being tried as adults due to the nature of their crimes. But it's important to say they were all innocent at that time, right? We were in a jail, not in a prison yet. And I saw how the media coverage of their cases shaped the outcomes at their trials and their entire lives moving forward. Something that happened when you were 15 years old. And so when I became a journalist, it was very clear to me that not only did I not want to be a part of that system that was perpetuating that for so many people and ruining their lives, right? But also, I thought, okay, if stories have so much negative power, what positive liberatory power can they also offer us to imagine something different than what we have here? Because it's messed up on so many levels. And so that's, I think I always see my work in kind of two ways of both the investigations, highlighting what's wrong, but then highlighting what could be. And those two things are, I think, yeah, equally important to me.
I like the way you said that. I mean, we spend so much energy on negative, frowning, fussing, cussing, but just imagine and putting out harmful stuff. Just imagine the amount of power that we would have to reverse that same thing, to put that into sunshine. Like I really like that. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm ready for these questions you got for everybody.
Okay, beautiful.
Let's be
So to
tricky.
get started, we touched on this a little bit, but I would love to ground our conversation in your relationship, Derek and Tina. And I'd love to hear what it was like working together. And we've been talking about the importance of fact-based reporting, right? Hearing from people who are inside to inform these stories rather than the state. So I'd love to just start by hearing from both of you. What's an example of a communication breakthrough y'all had while working together to get to a stronger story? And were there ever any challenges of working together, especially while Derek was inside?
Derek, do you want to start? You want me to start?
You can start, and then I'll run with it.
Yeah. Um, So Derek was the first person inside that I worked with as a reporter, and there was like, a learning curve for me that Derek had to really walk me through. Initially, we were doing snail mail, and I might have missed my opportunity to work with Derek because I wrote the address of his prison incorrectly. And somehow the person in the mailroom, Derek knew them and told Derek, like, hey, you have this package, but it wasn't correctly, whatever, addressed. And I guess I didn't realize kind of the sensitivity of even that kind of minor issue could have totally changed the course of our relationship. Like, if he didn't get that package, maybe he would have assumed that I never reached out to him. We might have never worked together. Um, and so it was just Derek kind of knowing this person that allowed us to connect. And then from there, Derek sort of walked me through like, this is what Securus is. This is how you sign up. This is how you find me. This is how we correspond. And then it was just a matter really of like figuring out how to work together once we were connected online, which still had its challenges that had nothing to do with Derek. Like there were email delays. At one point, there was like a glitch at his prison and it deleted all of his work. There was just so many communication challenges that actually had nothing to do with Derek or other people inside that I've worked with. They're all just kind of imposed. And so it's a matter of figuring out workarounds, and Derek had to help me figure out those workarounds because I was very inexperienced working with writers inside.
To piggyback off of what Tina was saying, one of the most important things to keep a communication breakdown from happening is patience. And Tina had tons of patience with me as a writer. She had tons of patience with me when I was able to explain to her this is how the system works. This is what it's designed to do. I was fortunately blessed to first start getting my work out through the use of and the medium of a 10-minute play. I would write 10-minute plays speaking about what happened in prison, what I observed, and telling stories of my fellow incarcerated people who would come to me and say, hey, this is what I've endured. This is my story. How can we put it out there? So I would just use these individual stories as character studies and write them as 10-minute plays. But that training prepared me to be able to write and do the things that I was doing so that I could work with Tina. I had to pitch something to Tina based off of my writing of the 10-minute plays that won me some awards from PEN America, who had a prison writing and justice program. And were it not for PEN, then I would have never met Tina. But what I wanted to stress to her was that the system purposely imposes these challenges because they don't want the stories getting out. They don't want us to tell the truth. They want to put their spin on it. And when I say the system, I'm talking completely widespread. It doesn't matter if it's a jail. It doesn't matter if it's a state prison or a federal prison. The reality of the situation is in order for incarceration to work, people they have to want and have the desire to incarcerate people. And it doesn't help to humanize someone that you're trying to incarcerate. So that's the reason why the system does what it does. When I first started studying journalism and had the desire to want to write, the thing that was stressed to me through everything that I picked up and read about, because I'm an autodidact, I didn't have any formal education. I was a high school dropout. And when I first started writing, I could barely spell, didn't know punctuation. I still don't know what a gerund or whatever that is, but I write to tell the truth. But I always picked up on something, no matter what I read about journalism, and it was a catchphrase. If it bleeds, it leads. And that's why we have great big bold faces in black versus little small snapshots of well-dressed individuals. They want to sensationalize. That's why the incarceration works the way it does because they want people to want to incarcerate people. So that's just, a little bit of my thought that the system imposes. I always heard, just to wrap it up real quick, but I always heard people say the system's broke. No, the system works perfectly fine. It's designed to incarcerate. There's nothing broke about it. We just have to find a new way to show that there's other ways to help people than to just throw them in cages and lock them away.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that that was one of the things that we had spoken about in our prep for this call, was just the toll that that dehumanizing language takes on a person every day. So would you just be able to describe some of those different terms that are used inside versus what people want to be called? And how, most people just want to be called by their name, right, rather than by a number. So we just be able to talk about that a little bit for Derek.
Absolutely. So when I first started working with Tina, she told me how some people in the newsroom wanted to use certain terms. And I'm one of those people, it's like, I'm not going to give too much pushback if I feel that it is something that is clear cut for me. But I would go around and ask my fellow incarcerated people what they thought about the terms that were used. When I came in, no one wanted to be called an inmate at all. They thought it was more respectable to be called a prisoner because you were in prison and being held against your will. But then it went deeper. People wanted to be known as a hostage. A lot of people just wanted to go by a name rather than a number. And some people adopted nicknames and all these different things just to keep from having to be called an inmate. It was so funny that it worked out from both angles as well. A corrections officer despises being called a guard. And they would often say to guard someone implies that you individuals are worth something. You have value. You don't. You're the scum of the earth. You're worthless. And that's what I heard on a daily basis for 20 years. Um, at the end of the day, people do just want to be known as human, you know, and we have so many desires about how to be addressed. I've seen someone walking down the hallway and an officer comes running through screaming, "Hey, hey." So someone turns around and says, "That's not my name. That's not my name. You can't just come running, hey, and expect me to stop." And then that individual, that person, gets maced, tased, handcuffed, and thrown in a hole because they were considered belligerent for saying, "Hey, I'm not going to stop when you call, hey, I do not know you're speaking to me." But me personally, while I was incarcerated, I would rather be called a prisoner than to be called an inmate because the officers would often jokingly say that the inmates are in on it. They want to be a part of it. They are a mate with the system. And if you take the in on and the mate with the system, then you put it together and now you're inmate. That was very hard for me to stomach. And I expressed that to Tina and I continue to express it in my writing.
Yeah, and one of the ways that Walisha went through this so well, but the ways that this language can be harmful, right, is it leads to tangible negative outcomes in people's lives. Tina, I'd love to hear from you a little bit how even well-meaning journalists, right, can come up with these kind of innocent narratives. Certain people deserve it, certain people don't, even when they think they're using humanizing language. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that can actually be um, inadvertently harming, even when people do have the best of intentions?
Yeah. I've seen this a lot in particular, especially under the Trump administration when it comes to mass deportations. um, lots of headlines. They're not actually taking criminals, or they're or like when young people had certain immigration statuses like DACA, they came here through no fault of their own, which totally throws their parents under the bus. And I've seen journalists and have had difficult conversations with journalists about how you're not actually doing your readers or immigrants a favor by kind of separating people into buckets of who is deserving of humane treatment, who is deserving to stay in the US, and who isn't. And it's the headlines about alleged criminality, I think, that are deeply harmful. And I think very often those come from a good place. I think the idea is we're going to show that the Trump administration isn't detaining and deporting who they say that they are. But to me, all that does is reinforces this narrative that there are people that are deserving of state violence and there are people that aren't, and we only care about the people that we think of as being undeserving of state violence, and that doesn't do anybody any favors.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Staying on that for 1 minute, the idea that journalists think that they're being helpful, but they're actually not. Derek, I want to ask you, who has been such a helpful journalist, can you talk about reporting inside, and how you approached that reporting process? And specifically saying, if something is happening, people need to know about this, right? How did you approach that work? And then how did starting to do that kind of writing change your experience of being inside, if at all? And what kind of stories did you report on? I would love for you to tell people.
Well, first and foremost, like I said, I started writing plays about prison. And in these plays, I showed the truth. I showed what good officers were like. I showed what bad officers were like. I showed what good wardens were like, what bad wardens were like. But I also had to balance it by showing incarcerated people who are trying to do their best to use this opportunity as a chance to build themselves and rebuild their lives. I wanted to show people that wanted to reach out and to put their old lives behind them and do something new. But in doing this and doing this writing, I built a little bit of a reputation as being someone who showed both sides of it, told the truth. And that's why when the mishap with the mailing happened, I was able to get a heads up. And it was from an officer who respected me as a writer and respected me as a truth teller. But the flip side of it is I actually had wrote a journalism piece about my boss at the prison who fell off the roof of the prison while we were working under unsafe conditions. And when this piece got published, I had people coming, staff, officers, everyone who were like, hey, you wrote this piece, it got published, and it's so amazing, and you told the truth. And it changed how things work situations, work conditions in the prison were. But I also had inmates who came to me, incarcerated individuals, prisoners, who came to me and said, how could you show this guy in this light, meaning my boss, the person I worked for 80 cents a day? And how could I write and tell about how he fell and how everyone else dealt with that? How could I tell that story and make him human? How could I tell the truth about it? How could I? And they were like, you didn't know him and he was nothing. And I was like, hold on, time out. First and foremost, this person is regardless of the uniform he wears, he's a person, and I'm a person. And this is the only person of anyone that I've worked for in my incarceration bit that treated me like a human. So what I also explained to him is I'd write this and get my stories out because people need to know. And if it's something that you want your family to know and something that you would tell them and you want to get out, then I have the right to get it out there as well because people deserve to know. If your family deserves to know, then the world deserves to know. And that's why I wrote.
Yes. Tina, I know Derek and I have both learned so much from you as I feel like you are a mentor to the world. But just for the journalists in the room, I know we only have 5 more minutes before we're going to get to questions, but can you just kind of walk through like what are some best practices for journalists and human-centered language that people are not trained in journalism school to do, but elevate their reporting and their work so much? What are some questions that people can be asking themselves as they're approaching their work?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, I sometimes feel like it's a blessing and a curse that I didn't go to journalism school or graduate from college. I just kind of learned journalism by doing, like Derek. And I think it's really important to let people inside lead the way when it comes to the language that they prefer to using. Derek and I talked a lot about how, my newsroom and other newsrooms have a style guide, and we, in edits, like would immediately default to incarcerated person or like person first language, but that's not always the language that people prefer, as Derek said. Like some people want to be called a prisoner in a piece because that's what they are. That's what they feel that they are when they're incarcerated. So letting them lead the way when it comes to language and coverage, I think is really important. Derek really did change the way that I think about reporting on the criminal legal system, because now I'm so reluctant to accept a pitch from a freelancer on the outside who wants to write about something that I know a person on the inside could do so much better, because they are living in that reality, because they are talking to other incarcerated people, because they are seeing these things firsthand. I think it's like more accurate journalism. I think that we should give those opportunities to incarcerated writers when we can. I also think, a lot of publications I've seen, they kind of, incarcerated writers have one lane. They can write personal essays. And I think that writing is really important. And the writing that Derek has done for Prism is often personal, his column is, and it's beautifully written. But I also, once Derek and I co-reported, it kind of blew my mind. Like, why aren't we co-reporting pieces with people inside? Why aren't we assigning stories to incarcerated writers, even stories that have nothing to do with the criminal legal system? Like if we're doing an election package, I want to know what people inside think about the election. Like why aren't we thinking more expansively about the coverage that we have people inside do? I think that's really important. And, if you can co-write pieces with people inside, I think that leads to more nuanced reporting. The way that Derek and I divvied up the work was that he excellent sourcing. Like Derek is talking to these people inside about the issues that we're reporting on. I have access to the internet and information that Derek can't access inside. And so that was the way that we divvied it. Like Derek was the person with the sources. He took the lead in writing, and then I did the outside research, and we combined forces. And I think it led to some really good reporting. So I would say that be inventive, like think about all of the ways that you can work with people inside, because there are communication challenges. And I say this all the time. It's never to do with the person though. Like, and I don't mean this to blow smoke. Like the people inside that I've worked with, they meet deadlines. They're easy edits. They collaborate with you. It's never those kinds of issues with freelancers inside. It's just the stuff that the state imposed. But if you work around that, it leads to excellent reporting that you would not get from anyone else. And it just wouldn't be possible in any other way.
100%. And I want to add onto there two things that Tina has taught me, which are so important. The first is that if anytime you're getting a source, like from the Georgia Department of Corrections, for example, always, always, always try to get a source, a quote from that person and their family, right? Like that we should not be solely relying just because they are an institution. And then the other thing is who is centered in a piece of reporting, right? That's something that Tina has always emphasized. Oh, my power might be going out. Okay, if that happens, I'm sorry. Something that Tina has always emphasized is specifically in that lead, in that first paragraph, who are you emphasizing and how are you describing them? And now I almost always lead with the person who has been directly impacted in that lead. Um, and I think that's things that can feel obvious, but I don't often or always see other reporters and institutions do, in addition to all of the other things that Walisha outlined for us, that are wrong. So before we go into our questions, I know we're a little over. We would love to end our panel portion, by inviting Derek to read, a selection of his writing.
Thank you. Um, so this piece is is from my column "Never Eat the Candy on Your Pillow," and it's called "The Sun on My Skin." I've been incarcerated for nearly 19 years, and during my time inside, I've often wondered whether the sun would feel better on the other side of the fence. Dear reader, I can still remember a teacher I had as a young child who enlisted my class to participate in a science experiment centered on a beautiful houseplant. Our task was simple enough. When our name was randomly pulled out of a box, it was our job to water the houseplant. That is, until the houseplant was placed in a closet. The teacher said this is how we would learn about photosynthesis. I knew nothing about plants or how they grew, but I did know that the plant was vibrantly alive and would likely suffer in the dark closet. I loved how beautiful the plant was, and I looked forward to the day when it would be my turn to water it. Once the plant was in the closet, the teacher created a watering schedule on the chalkboard that listed our names in alphabetical order. The unfortunate T that begins my last name meant that I was among the last students to water the plant. When it was finally my turn, I entered that closet and saw something traumatizing. The plant was dying, and its entire body, which is how I thought of its stems and leaves, had leaned towards the door as if searching for a way out into the light. By the end of the experiment, the plant died. The teacher taught us a valuable lesson about how plants need sunlight as a source of energy. I found myself thinking about this science experiment recently when I became ill. My body a reminder of what happens when you're trapped inside for too long. A few weeks ago, I was taken for a medical trip outside of prison. The transport officer had me stripped down to my boxers and socks and then gave me an orange short-sleeved shirt and pants to wear. The back of my shirt was stamped with the letters DOC, making it clear to anyone who saw me that I belonged to the Department of Corrections. My wrists were cuffs, and a chain was fed around my waist and through a box-like contraption that allowed the officer to secure my cuffs to my waistline. Then came the shackles around my feet, also connected to the chain around my waist. Finally, I was led out into the sunlight and into the waiting van. I lifted my face to the sky and drank it all in. How long's it been since you went on a trip? The transport officer asked. A long, long time, I replied. I've been incarcerated nearly 19 years, and during my time inside, I'd often wondered whether the sun would feel better on the other side of the fence. In the van, my eyes followed the long prison driveway that led out of the main road, a road I could barely see from the window of my dorm, a road I fantasized about heading down, a road I no longer had to dream of. I didn't blink or breathe as we pulled on to that road. I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear as cars with makes and models I'd never seen before zoomed past. Then my stomach tightened like a kid on a roller coaster for the first time. Did cars always pass so close? Were we in danger of being hit? I fought down my sense of anxiety and did my best to enjoy the ride. The pastoral scenery of fields, cows, and old wooden fences soon gave way to open highways and billboards with moving images like huge television screens. I stared in awe at how far technology had come since I first lost my freedom. Childhood returned as I remembered the first time I saw the movie Blade Runner. The future was now. The ride lasted over an hour, and despite the cuffs, chains, and shackles trapping my body, I had never felt more free. The phrase culture shock came to mind as my eyes were bombarded by sights so different from the concrete block walls, fencers, and razor wire I was used to. My thoughts raced with the sight of the Kentucky River and ads for foods and products I'd never tasted or knew existed. Everywhere I looked were people I'd never met, a community I'd been apart from for so long. I leaned closer to the van window to feel the sun on my skin and to look at the world I so longed to rejoin. How was it possible that the world had changed so much? What had I missed? When we arrived at the hospital, I climbed awkwardly out of the van. It was the first time in many years that I found myself standing outside of prison. I've always heard folks say that they felt like kissing the ground when they were released. I could never relate to that, but now I could. I felt the sun and the cold February wind on my skin. I didn't care that we had to stand outside for several minutes before we were let into the hospital. I could have stood there all day. We entered the elevator and I felt my stomach lurch. I was awash with giddiness until I imagined the looks I would receive as I clanked and jingled my way past civilians who would no doubt look at me in abject horror. Would they move away from me if I passed them too closely? The doors slid open and we exited the elevator. The people we passed barely looked up from their phones, and even fewer people seemed to care that a burly black man in restraints was being led through the hospital corridors by an armed corrections officer. Once again, I felt free. I almost even felt normal. The hospital's nurses and doctors were obviously accustomed to treating incarcerated people. They provided me with care and then sent me on my way, like they would any other person. Did this make me a person again? Did I deserve to be treated like any other person? My mood changed when I remembered this was but a brief foray into freedom. The realization that I would soon be back at the prison loomed over me. I was struck with a deep sadness. I'm sometimes my own worst enemy, and because I know that, I very intentionally decided to just focus on the return trip to the prison. I had one more hour of freedom. On the drive back, I breathed deeply and tried to appreciate my small adventure into the world I wanted so badly to reintegrate into. A cold rain cascaded down the van windows, but I swear I could still feel the sun on my skin. Thank you.
Derek, Derek,
Wow, you can
Derek.
write.
He can write, y'all. Yeah, I'm like emotional. I don't really know what to say. Questions?
Before we jump into the Q&A, I just want to say thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was amazing. That was amazing. And at first I kept saying, oh my God, he's gonna trigger me if he say prisoner or inmate one more time. But it all worked out with when you said it with with your writing. Because it's very hard to go in a space, even though I was only locked up less than a year, it's very hard to go from a space where people have stripped you of your dignity. And it's I can imagine the experience is completely different from somebody who did decades like you did, but it's also different from the perspective of a woman because dignity is completely stripped. Women are strip searched in front of male officers. Um, Again, they don't women have different types of needs, so I definitely can understand that because some people have your name right here, and you all you have to do is learn people. Yeah, they says 3,000 people may be in a prison, but if you were a teacher at a university of 3,000 students, you remember their names, and it's not hard to call a person their name, even if you call them their last name. So I like the fact that when you said that, am I worthy of this? Yes, you are. Everybody's worthy of that, regardless of what anybody has done. We have a role to take care of people. If you're not going to take care of them, you shouldn't incarcerate them. If you're not going to love your neighbor, stop calling yourself a Christian. If you're not going to do certain things and not live the way you should be, stop doing it. So yeah, I because I kept saying, where is this going with the title? but I loved it. You can write. I wish I could write like that. But yeah, so we're gonna go ahead and open it up for Q&A. But I want to let you all know before we do that, tomorrow night at 8 p.m. We have a whole. If any of you all have looked at our events, we have a slew of events coming up. But just this week, tomorrow, we have our virtual family support group that we have monthly for families of currently and formerly incarcerated people, as well as other formerly incarcerated people, to just connect, share resources, encourage. That would have been a beautiful encouragement to just be in a space to offer non-legal advice and support. What do I do when I go and see my husband, or what do I do when I go and see my son? These kind of things that a lot of the formerly incarcerated folks on the call can help with some of that anxiety, and sometimes we connect as well. This Saturday, for those of you who are on the call, if you're formerly incarcerated, definitely let us know. Email us because we want to stay connected with you. This Saturday, we'll be with Colleen in Atlanta. It's unpaid, but it is free lunch, and it's from 12 to 2 to be able to get on record your experience with prison labor as well as work release. Next week, I think on July 15th, all of you are welcome. We will be treating formerly incarcerated people, their families, and our allies and advocates, which are, of course, Tina, Colleen, to Douglasville. Come out with some free unlimited bowling and dinner. We're paying for up to 20 people in partnership with Bar Business. So if you're in the Douglasville area, Atlanta area, come out and hang out with us. And there are tons of other things that are virtual. We're going to be doing some in Stockbridge, where we're going to be working with individuals there who are on probation, who need substance use treatment, anger management. We're going to be doing that. And then we're going to be Legal Action Center, where we're going to be talking about, and I'm sure a lot of the immigration stuff will be coming up on that, because we're going to be talking about healthcare, particularly why healthcare is always an issue for folks who are incarcerated. Again, that comes with dignity as well. And so please, please, please join us for our upcoming events, whether you can attend them virtually or in person. And in the last week, we'll be in Columbus and for those of you who don't mind driving now, you want to come to Columbus on July 28th, we're having a reentry simulation to give you a feel of what it feels like to be locked up and have to get out. And then 48 hours, you got to get a job, get a house stay, you got to get to the bus station, got to get here, got to get there. If not, you're going back to jail. So that's going to be on the 28th, but we'll make sure we drop that link. I think, Colleen, we did drop a link for Tina, and Tina dropped the link for Derek. But if you have an actual link where people can go and see some of your writings, please feel free to drop that. And we're going to open it up for any questions. If anybody has any questions for anybody, just take yourself off mute and ask your question.
It's perfectly fine to ask questions. We're all here to answer.
Hey, I got some maybe it's information or question, but first of all, I want to appreciate and Alicia, thank you again for you're doing all the effort. I just want to point out to everybody else. So just a big round of applause for you, because I mean, you're all over the state of Georgia, but you're just on it, and everything you're about is what I'm about, honestly. And I told you when I met you, I was like, I think your ideas need to be my ideas up at the state level for some representation to get this statewide. I told you that. I think it's just so in line. Some of the things I have a whole page of notes. I've just been writing some of the things you brought up, like Michael Brown, man, that was a whole hands up thing because of just how flagrant, they just painted a picture of this narratives in media or just, representation of like, oh, he's a black guy, but he was high. And they try to find some video of him like pushing over a convenience store or something like that. Like he's a crazy, reckless person, when he was shot with his hands up, walking with his back towards an officer, right? That's not the narrative spin of what it is and what actually happens are two completely different stories that we see. There's, let me see, I'm going down the list. The journalistic failures, the positive light, negative lights, you can see it in news articles. You see things when stories are written for a shooting that they don't have a picture of who the person is. That's, it's a white guy. And then it's just like, they just leave out intricate details that are just like common knowledge that you already know who the shooter was. You can tell who he was, if he was a MAGA guy or if he wasn't. For all the presidential shootings, go back and look at all of those. They will not show a picture of those people until a few days later. And they're like nice, cool pictures, and they're all, white men that had rifles and golf courses and on tops of roofs and all these things. Man, it's over the top. One of the things I wanted to point out, and maybe you can help with or question is, but there's narratives that are spoken across media, I think across states, nationwide. One is in Florida that happened about a month ago with protesters and the police officers stating publicly, you know, protesters are going to get away. We will kill you, right? That line. And then in Columbus, Georgia, here where I'm at, about 2 weeks ago, there was a terrible murder at one of these local stores for over a couple bucks. The
I had it on my
the
Facebook page.
the guy was running away, I guess, and the cops got him, and they tried to had a firefight. Which, if there's a firefight shooting at police officers, I'm sure there's escalation of violence. There's protocols that have to be done, and if they have to shoot back at somebody to the police, they do that. But when the lead comes on TV and says, "If you shoot at our police, we will kill you," it's already. I mean, journalists can only report those quotes as what they are factually because he factually said that. So it looks like the media is supporting it when it's just quoting the facts, because that's just how people talk now in these positions without, due process, or we have protocols that for escalation. None of that, just we will kill you. And then later, a couple days later, I think Columbus supported it. I think Harris County supported the statements. How do you battle that? It's nothing that the journalists wrote. It's the statements that are coming out from the people, but then it's getting support. But more importantly, it's the same quote from two different states. It's just this narrative that they're pushing. So how is that, I don't know how to handle that.
Yeah, it's such a good question. Tina, do you want to answer? I just saw you go off mute.
Oh, I was just going to very quickly say, I really do think it's in the framing and the sourcing. If I were a reporter covering that story, I would speak to abolitionists. I would highlight data that shows that it doesn't matter if you shoot at the police, if you're Black or another kind of marginalized person, that they shoot and kill people who are unarmed all the time. Journalists have leeway in how they frame the story, and I think it's really dishonest for reporters to say, well, we're just reporting what we were told. You have a lot of autonomy in who you talk to for reporting, what your angle is, how you frame it. So you can report what the police said, but you can also report around how what the police is saying is dishonest, or how it's a very particular kind of angle, or how it kind of obscures the rest of the story. You need to use that leeway if you're a reporter who does care about justice. You can't just run with the police, what they say, unless I would also think that would make it into a headline, right? But it should make it into a headline because it's alarming, not just because it happened, but because it's terrifying that the police are saying that to the community. So I do think that reporters are sometimes confined depending on the kind of newsroom that they work in, but there's definitely a lot of leeway in who you decide to speak to, how you decide to frame the story. As Colleen said, who's in the lead of the story. I think those are all things that you can lean into no matter what kind of newsroom that you work for.
Yeah, Tina said everything that I was going to say, that it's all around that additional sourcing and reporting around the story. So in that example, talking to community members and saying, how does it make you feel? What is your experience with this police department when they say things like that? Um, so that that's not the only thing. I think that's where we get into trouble, especially with local news reporting, as Derek said, if it bleeds, it leads, when that's the only thing that's there and there's no reporting around it. Um, I think that it goes back to what we're saying, right? It's not factual because someone's having an experience based on someone saying that. But yeah, I saw that clip too, and I think also to what Tina said, just emphasizing how disturbing that is in the reporting. And I think that, as journalists, we can try our best to be neutral, but our audiences are very, very smart. They can see through things if you report that and they're like, wait, that's disturbing. People see through that. Um, so yeah.
Thank you so much for that question. I had a question, and I wanted to see if we had to do a call of action, because I would like to actually do a call of action. If each one of you would at least do a call of action of what you would want for the media to do. I think so I wanted to ask, my question was, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but do you think, because I'm not a reporter, I used to always wonder, well, maybe they get a bigger commission if the more disrespectful the headline is? Or what is the motivation behind a reporter who says, I really could use a mugshot of a white guy, but I think I'd rather use their school yearbook photo. But I'm gonna use the mugshot. What as a reporter or journalist, Tina and Colleen, what do you think actually happens from that time of them maybe thinking to use that? Do you think it's intentional, or do they get extra money for putting the word felon in a headline, or do they get extra money by using a white mugshot versus, I mean, black folks mugshot versus white boys school photos? I mean, what possesses? I mean, to me, it would be clearly obvious, like this doesn't look right. But what possesses a journalist? What do you think it is that allows them? Because I know you have to proofread this, and it probably goes from one you to somebody else's desk to proofread it. It goes from several different people before it goes to the editor to be published. What is it that you think that is inherent in journalists that has allowed something to go from this point and nobody said, wait a minute, why do you have a burglar dead center on the front page with a black man's picture so big and a white man who actually killed somebody who's over here in the left side corner? I mean, I think the community and the citizens will really be more like to really know about somebody who's running around here killing people as opposed to somebody who might be rough. What do you think that is? I mean, is it racism? Is it just laziness? Is it liking to see something spark up? Because I used to think maybe they get more money with more clicks they get on a thing. I don't know what it is. What is it that would make journalists choose the bad over doing what you all do? Saying I can make just as good enough story without actually dehumanizing someone and without disrespecting anybody. Why do you think journalists choose to go the other route?
Yeah, well, I have a two-part answer. I think the first is that despite the fact that many journalists like to think of themselves otherwise, journalism has almost always in the history of our country been the mouthpiece for power. And as a result, it has been a mouthpiece for systemic racism. If you go to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, Bryan Stevenson's museum, you will see clippings from newspapers where they are encouraging people to go to lynchings, right? So journalism has always, like Derek was saying, it's trying to create a narrative that legitimizes the system as it currently exists. And that's a huge problem with reporting in the South. Many, many people do not want to go on the record against conservative voices here, against Republican journalists do not, because they don't want to lose access to those sources. So that's one reason why people will do that, because they say, well, I want to have Brian Kemp's ear because I might need him for a source later. So they are not going to do that kind of rigorous reporting. The flip side is that people do make more money the more clicks that you get on a site. And I've never been on the like ad marketing side of this, so I don't know. But we see this with social media, right? The most salacious possible thing is the thing that gets the clicks, that gets the attention, that gets the views. So you do get more ad dollars, the more people that go to your site. And that's why I think places like Prism, places like Courier that are not reliant on ad dollars are able to do very different kinds of reporting, more liberated reporting, because we have people who are donating to our work. So everyone should support your local journalist. But that
Yes.
creates a different standard for what people are reporting. Because if you're watching Fox 5, for example, they get more views the more like commercials they have going, right? So that would be my response. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear other people's.
I think all of that, definitely 100%. And I also think it's really important to note that mainstream media in particularly is still overwhelmingly white, right? So you have the decision makers, the editors in a newsroom have an incredible amount of power. If I wanted to, a person files a story with me, I could totally change it. I'm writing the headline. I'm kind of framing the story. I'm choosing the photo that runs with the story. Editors have an incredible amount of power. They're at the top of the newsroom and they're still overwhelmingly white. So when you have, plus when you add racism, when you add kind of journalism's myth of objectivity, which pretends that it's neutral, but it's completely not, it's kind of like a toxic stew of stuff that comes together in this framing. And it's really alarming how often those newsrooms, I mean, I've gotten into arguments with people about how you shouldn't run mugshots at all. Like, why are we doing this at all? And it's like it never occurred to them. Or like editors think, well, this is a tidy, easy photo for a story. You know, we don't have to pay a licensing agreement. We don't have to contract with a freelancer. We could just grab this from the police department. So it's also laziness. You know, it's like all of these things coming together that lead to really, really racist and harmful coverage. It's all of it.
It makes sense. All right. Does anybody else have any more questions before we end? Well, we would like to thank you all so much for joining us. And again, please join us at our upcoming events. If you can donate, we are a volunteer-led organization. Also, support your local journalists who are doing really good at humanizing the stories of the people that they're centering. Keisha, if you're definitely just as impacted, I've sent you a message that you didn't see it, but if you're just as impacted, definitely email or contact with us. If you're in Atlanta, come see us Saturday, RSVP. And that'll be it. But we will get this uploaded on YouTube hopefully by tomorrow. Make sure we get some email chats and stuff out to you. But I want to thank you all so much, Colleen, Tina, and Derek, for your experience, your expertise, and your vulnerability, and your bravery and your boldness. Because you brought out a very valid point. Everything is ultra white, and it's also the same thing you see when you see a lot of males, white males, in this space. I've seen it several times when a woman, whether she's black or white, has been a rape victim. I've seen how instead of turning it out that this is a woman who was violated, it was, what was she wearing? She shouldn't have done this. And overwhelmingly is usually a male reporter and, like you said, a male editor. And that stuff has to end, because when you're looking at the news, you're supposed to be looking at something that's unbiased. Not give me the facts. I want to know, if I'm wanting to talk about data center, don't give me what you feel or whatever you're leaning because of. I need to know the truth. If it's going to be an earthquake coming through here, don't soften it up for me. Tell me the truth. And I think you can be tactful and truthful without being disrespectful. So thank you all so very much. And we would have loved to see more journalists on this call. And those who did register are journalists. If we find that did register in the registration, we'll make sure we connect you all. And hopefully at some point down the line, we can get together and actually host an actual training for journalists in person. And maybe Elliot will want to host that. I think Irma has a question, and we'll close out with Elliot before we go.
Real quick, Derek, where did you get the title, Never Eat the Candy on Your Pillow? Where did that come from?
All right, real quick. So I read Orange is the New Black by Piper Kerman, and I thought it was good, but I knew I could do better. So
Okay.
I wanted to write something that would catch people's eyes, but also tell the story of how prison rape happens. And one of the things that I learned, one of the very first things I learned was never eat the candy on your pillow, because if someone leaves something on your pillow, it's a trick. And once you eat it, now you owe them. And they don't want to be paid back in that piece of candy. They want something else. But I wanted to be tactful enough to hook the reader in so that they could learn that story. So that's how I came up with the title.
You did.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to close you out with Elliot.
Real quick, one last thing, just to think about, probably a whole nother conversation. But when you talk about these media narratives and the news stories, look at when the police have conducted criminal activity and how the whole news story shifts, where they always kind of use the line, well, it's just one bad apple, but they never want to complete that phrase that ruins the whole bunch. because that's what's really happening in these pockets of communities of police enforcement around the nation, when you have these one bad apples. But the whole narrative on that media reporting also is reflected when that side is now the criminal activity and it's the police side. You can see the whole shift in the narrative. Just thoughts to think about for next time, maybe a whole nother conversation.
Well, thank you so very much.
And everyone, round of applause for Walisha, the hardest working woman in Georgia.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, I want you to give this presentation to journalists. I'm going to stay in touch with you.
Okay. Well, I'm always down with it because I definitely think there needs to be some type of coalition of human-centered journalists. Y'all need to start a coalition. Be some real badasses. This is what we do. And as a matter of fact, I'm gonna leave y'all with what I found on Prism's page. Let me open it up right quick. And I thought it was really good. I'm like, this is what they need. This is what they need. Y'all need to get together, not to just do trainings, but sort of lead. What does it say? What is it that says? That opens up when you do your Prism page, Tina. What does it say?
I should know that. Let me
The one about the freedom of liberation or something. What is it? I saw
The
it when I
freedom
popped
to
up.
write.
It was something that popped up on the page when I went to the page, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that is awesome." Yeah, it didn't come up. Liberation is there it is. Collective liberation requires collective action.
Absolutely.
I love that. And I think that is a great point to leave with. And I think this is what I was saying when I know you have things, Chamber of Commerce for businesses, you have all these other different things, but there really, and it may be some kind of media thing, but there really needs to be something for journalists where they can do that same thing. Let's turn a lot of salt into sunshine. We don't have to, let's first of all get a bunch of articles and actually rewrite them in a humane way and see if you don't get the same impact. So I would love to see that. Well, thank y'all so much for joining us. And again, we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. And thank you all so very much.